Um, well, I'm Art Halbardier, the guy who sends you all the emails. So that's just so we get everybody identified here. I want to ask, how many of you are here for the first time? Anybody for the first time? That's great. 250. Okay. Great. And how many of you might have been here in 2007 for the first Bach Cantata? Aha. 3, 4. Oh, well, Kathy. Yes, you definitely were here. Well, I just asked that because it's those of you who come here year after year, and then new participants who come for the first time is what's kept us lively for 16 years now, even with the 1 year of interruption, or 2 years of interruption that we had from COVID. And we are also here because of the solid and wonderful support that we get from the people of Mount Olive Lutheran Church through the budget that they fund us through, and also through the gifts of many individuals that want to support us. Likewise, the foundation gives us a grant each year so that since we started, we've never had to charge any more than the basic registration fee. But of course, many of you are generous enough to give in addition to that, and that's very much appreciated because this is not a cheap enterprise. And then there's Mount Olive Music and Fine Arts that also give us a grant each year to help support this so that we can keep going forward. So let's see. Uh-oh. There's a reminder there's a new supporter of Bach Tage this year, and they want to be recognized. So they have a brief video that they're uploading right at this moment so that they can share, as they say, some previously unknown information about Bach that their researchers have discovered, and they're sending it to us right now. So whatever it is, let's see. Oh boy.
Yeah, sure does.
Well, that was definitely informative, wasn't it? I have a feeling that's possibly the portion of this presentation you're going to remember the longest. But yes, but we have been here for 16 years, and we are grateful for everyone who makes that possible. Introduce some people. Cantor David, where'd he go? There he is, back in the back. As usual, he's in the back, turn around so we all recognize him. And Kathy Romy over here, always in front, yes, everybody in their places. And our pastor, Joseph Crippen, back here munching away on his bagel and drinking his tea. So they were, Kathy and David were the ones that had the idea of doing a Bach Tage back in their mid or the early years of the 21st century, and here it is still. Some of you may not be aware that Kathy's father, Royce Salzman, died this past spring. Her father, with his friend Helmuth Rühling, founded the Oregon Bach Festival now in its 53rd year. Royce had a vision for a festival devoted to music of Bach, and he brought the Oregon Bach Festival from those very humble beginnings into a major international festival which brings together not only the music of Bach, but of many other ones, including, I think they did the first performance of the Credo by Krzysztof Penderecki, you know, things like that. It's a very wonderful event in these days, and now in its 53rd year. And of course, Royce was also a wonderful teacher and conductor at the University of Oregon. His students hold highly respected positions around the world. We have copies of his obituary, which I'll put out on the table over here. For obvious reasons, I didn't put them out earlier because I don't want you reading them during my presentation. I'm that insecure. So, speaking for Bach Tage and all of us, I want to say that we're grateful to Royce and Phillips that they that they had a daughter named Kathy who's honored and inspired us these years. I'd like us to dedicate our work this weekend to the memory of Royce, who has given the world of music, and especially of early music, such a great contribution. So, our cantata for this year, it's a pivotal composition from Bach's first year in Leipzig. In point of fact, it's the first cantata that he actually composed in Leipzig, as you'll see when I go through the calendar of the early weeks. Now, some years we've done other music than Bach, but we never ventured outside the German tradition until this year when we're going to do a beautiful setting of the Magnificat from the French Baroque era to sing at our evening prayer. So that's our work for this weekend. And I want to give credit to the wonderful people at Canberra Baroque in Canberra, Australia, who have an edition of this that they have produced within the last, what's the date on that, like 2021 or something like that? And they had the score up on the public domain website, but they did not have the parts available. So I wrote to Peter Young, who I don't know from anyone, but I wrote to him and said, could we get the parts? And he said, yes, they're available, or just go to the website and you can order them. And I said, well, what is the charge going to be? Because I don't know how to convert to Australian dollars. Oh, it's okay, no charge. It's fine. I'll just send them to you free. So we are grateful to Canberra Baroque, because otherwise we would have some really bad old editions instead of a very clean new one. So we're going to start in Cantata 105, because there's so much here to say about it, both in terms of context as well as content. I'm going to spend most of my time there, but we will get a little bit to the Magnificat as well. So we have Bach, who arrived in Leipzig on the 22nd of May, 1723. It was reported in the Hamburg newspaper that it required 2 carriages to carry the Bachs and their 5 children. At this point, there was 4 children from Bach's first marriage, but Maria Barbara had died just a year or 2 before this. And Sebastian's second marriage with Anna Magdalena had only produced 1 child, but of course they were just getting started at this point. They would have 12 more children in their lifetime. Of course, Bach's debut cantata was set for just 1 week later, for May 30th. So clearly Bach must have composed Cantata 75 before he left Curtin in order to be able to get the parts copied, the singers prepared, everything that had to be done in just 1 week. You may remember this from 2012. His first cantata is a huge piece of 14 movements, possibly Bach's way of putting his stamp on the new cantorship that he had taken. 14 being the sum of J, S, B, A, C, H, the numeric equivalents of his name. He must have also at least partially composed the music for his second Sunday, number 76, because it is equally large, 14 movements. And this was our cantata in 2016. John Eliot Gardner, many of you probably know his book, he says that Bach's greatest challenge throughout this first year was just keeping pace with the weekly demand. Because his cantata writing prior to coming to Leipzig was fairly limited. Primarily the few years that he spent in Weimar between 1714 and 18. And even there he only composed about one cantata per month. And Sebastian would recycle most of these cantatas during his very first year in Leipzig, just to keep up. But for the first few weeks, the epistles for these early weeks were from the first letter of John, and they gave him themes that really fired his imagination. So in number 75, it was compassion for the poor, and for 76, it was loving one another as Christ has loved us. But even though he quickly turned to his small collection of Weimar cantatas, he didn't sacrifice faithfulness to the themes of the day. He did turn quickly, though, to Cantata 21, which was originally from 1714. And those who were here, remember this was our very first cantata at Bach Tage. If you've forgotten the music, that's okay. I'm sure you haven't forgotten the delightfully warm temperatures. Surprised anyone came back after that. The next week was Cantata 185, which also came from his Weimar files, and he paired it with a short and fairly simple new composition just to balance things out. But of course, St. John's the Baptist Day was a day he had never composed for before, and so he had to prepare a new cantata. But it was also not a difficult piece. Probably he only used 4 soloists to perform it. Interestingly, there is no record of a cantata for the following Sunday. Just don't know. Or nor for the one after that. July the 4th. Maybe they took off for July 4th. But for the Feast of the Visitation, he did bring out Cantata 147, which was, again, written in Weimar for the 4th Sunday of Advent. And for the Feast of the Visitation, just required a little bit of working with the poetry. And so it was usable again. As I said, no cantata for the next week, but then for the next Sunday after that, a cantata that had also come from that same Advent season in 1716. Here the text is again altered to fit the theme of that Sunday. Those who have analyzed the score of Cantata 136 know that it's probably a parody of an existing sacred or secular cantata, but nobody knows what that cantata was. But the evidence is such that it looks like it has a new text. That's what a parody is giving new music, or old music, a new text. And Bach did that an awful lot in his time in Leipzig. So, to say it briefly, Bach didn't do very much composing during his early weeks, but he was very busy. He was recruiting and engaging new orchestra members, he was training soloists, and above all, he and his collaborator poet were planning. Because Bach was eager to pursue his vision of what he called a well-ordered church music. In Weimar, he and his collaborator Salomo Frank had developed a new style of cantata, utilizing freely composed texts rather than only scripture and chorales, but freely composed poetry to interpret the appointed scriptures, creating essentially a sermon in music. Well, now as cantor, with a huge emphasis on the weekly cantata, he was eager to take this new style to a higher level. And the first of that series was Cantata 105, our cantata for this weekend. But dear Sebastian was a bit concerned, and rightly so, that his new style of cantata was not going to sit well with the Leipzig clergy, or at least some members of it. Some of these clergy were overtly suspicious that the new cantor planned to introduce what they referred to as operatic elements into the church music, that this newfangled cantatas would compete in some way with what they thought was their turf, preaching. Bach had survived his theological examination by these skeptical clerics a few months before, but he may have picked up signals that he and some of the clergy were not exactly on the same theological wavelength. Jaroslav Pelikan's classic book, which I don't know whether it's still in print or not, but you can get used copies frequently, Bach and the Theologians, it's rather what you'd expect of Pelikan, a very deep dive into this matter. Many of you have read his book. During the 16th century, Luther and his followers had challenged the authoritarian hierarchy of the church to return to the classic orthodox and scriptural theology, which they had departed from, in his view. Well, in his book, Pelikan, for example, quotes Einar Billing, who said, "Regard nothing as the theology of Luther that cannot be reduced to a simple corollary of the forgiveness of sins." I'm going to leave that up there just for comparison as we go on. Now, Pelikan, of course, is a very thorough and penetrating and hard to read sometimes version of the issues with the Leipzig clergy, as is Eric Chafee in this book, J.S. Bach's Johannine Theology. However, maybe a more concise and consumable version is from this gentleman, Richard Rohr, a contemporary theologian and historian. In this book, The Universal Christ, he describes what he calls a persistent alternative theology that first reared its ugly head during the Middle Ages. Rohr labels it, as it goes on there, as a theology of sin management administered by a too often elite clergy, which is a pretty remarkable statement from a Roman Catholic priest, I'd say. Specifically, he calls it a theology of mistrust and suspicion of people, full of fiery notions of hell, of divine rewards and punishments, of who's an insider and who's an outsider, and describes an angry God who demands satisfaction, all managed by an authoritarian clergy. And Rohr points out that this domineering clergy and rigid doctrines and punitive practices like this persist into the 21st century. He says, and I quote, "They are the bread and butter issues of today's megachurches and the prosperity gospel." Now you can fill in the blank of which other denomination, I should say, he may be describing. Personally, I can't think of a denomination that hasn't at some time in history been touched by these very same things. It's quite ironic, actually, that rigid and judgmental positions and authoritarian style of leadership were the things that the reformers had protested back in the 16th century. And here they were beginning to reemerge among Lutherans during the 18th century. And as we know, they remain alive and well right up to the present day, in our circles too, in some places. So, eventually, Sebastian and the clergy would clash in a very ugly way. But at this point, dear Johann had only been cantor for a few weeks. So for now, he and his poets determined they would proceed with caution, but never at the expense of their integrity. And this would not be an easy thing to do, because the appointed scriptures for many of the coming Sundays after Trinity were kind of a potential minefield, with warnings against false prophets, hypocrisy, expectation that a true believer will stand apart from the sinful world, and if they don't, they're in peril of their own soul. So these last weeks, and you get to the last weeks of the liturgical year, and you get the warnings of judgment at the end times. Well, for preachers that have kind of a legalistic orientation, material like this was like tossing red meat in their direction, you know. So, how would Bach and his poet tread softly on this treacherous path? Well, in Cantata 105, we sort of see the direction that they took. So I gave you a translation, which if you just take it out, we could just skim through it quickly and see what they did. By the way, his poet collaborator is unknown for this first year. We don't know who this person was. Some people think it may have been the Bürgermeister of Leipzig, the mayor, in other words, who was one of Bach's chief supporters. His name was Gottfried Lange, but nobody really knows who it was. But he was very skillful. So let's see. The text for the day, the gospel for the day, was Luke 16, 1 through 9, which is Jesus' quirky and confusing parable of a manager who gets fired for skimming funds from his master's business. Getting fired leaves him terrified because he says his only talent he has is managing. We might add it's also stealing from his boss. But as the saying goes, once a grifter, always a grifter. So here he is out on his own, and he goes to search for some new allies, those who owe his master the most, and he starts writing off major discounts off their debt, 20% for this one, 50% the other one. Now, there's no direct reference to the parable in our cantata, and I'm certainly not going to try to explain the parable to you. But what Bach and his poet did was create instead a profound homily on sin, on the denial of sin, over human anxiety, over punishment for sin, over the futility of trying to escape when you are a captive to sin, and above all, God's gracious and merciful response to our sin. So, a genuine sermon in music, probably quite different from the one a Leipzig preacher may have given that day. In chorus number 1, what do we hear? Even the most moralistic clergy in Leipzig would have been pleased with the sinner's pleading for mercy, where it says, "Do not enter into judgment with your servant, for surely no one living is righteous in God's sight." And then just doubling down on that, you get the second recitative, where we look at the depth of the sinner's angst. His words echo Psalm 51, which we use on Ash Wednesday. The sinner begs to not be cast away. He says, "I bow down before God in humility. My offense is grievous, my soul is weak, and there is no way I can deny or cover that up." This is a contrite and humble sinner begging for God's mercy. But then the aria that follows, number 3, reminds us that humility and remorse is not the only response of sinners caught in the act. Some will blame others, or they'll claim innocence, or they'll deny, or make excuses for their words or actions, or try to cover them up with lies. Now we're halfway through the cantata, time-wise, over halfway through the cantata, and Sebastian may have assumed at this point that he was beyond the clergy's attention span. Because number 4 completely changes the subject. In number 4, we hear instead of the victorious Christ of St. John's Gospel. Oh, I'm sorry, I got behind here. Let you look at those. Sorry, I forgot to press the button at the right moment. Hold on, please. Okay. That's the nature of sin. So we hear in number 4 the victorious Christ, who is so beautifully captured in those scriptures. A Christ who restores sinners to life with God, forgives them, and gives them a fresh beginning. The very first word in the recitative is "vol," which means secure, or happy, or blessed. Of course we should be, for our debt of sin is set aside. The writing on our guilty sentence is covered with Jesus' own blood. Jesus has nailed that ugly document to the cross. Christ has crushed sin and death underfoot. And he concludes by saying, our Savior leads forgiven sinners to life eternal with God. And then in the next movement, a aria, we hear a brand new sound in this cantata, which we haven't heard before. Joy, of all things. But why shouldn't we be joyful? For we see such a great gift of freedom. But the response is to no longer delight in worldly or earthly things. As St. Paul says, we should walk in new life. And then we conclude in the chorale, where the tortured singer offers a song of confidence and trust, using the very words of Jesus in John 10 and 14. None of those who are his will be lost. So Bach and his anonymous poet strike this balance of law and gospel for the remaining weeks of the Trinity season. Of course, by the time of the St. John Passion, Bach has forgotten about compromise and accommodating. The Passion is just literally a praise of God, whose love for humanity just erupts in a massive divine enough. It's over. Sin and death are crushed. They are broken. So that's how this cantata unfolds in 3 movements based in the law and 3 clearly based in the gospel. Very Lutheran stuff. In 3 movements of the cantata, we get drawn into the angst of the sinner by Bach using a very common Baroque representation of anxiety and dread, the tremolo. Now the tremolo is not the same thing as it is a vibrato. It's done with a bow rather than with the left hand on those strings. For a tremolo, like you see in the bass line here of cantata, of chorus number 1, the string players repeat a note pattern 2, 3, or 4 times under a single bow stroke. So it goes, creating kind of a pulsing effect, like a heartbeat that you can literally feel outside your own chest when you're under stress sometimes. Listen to how this would work. One of the most familiar examples of tremolo is the beginning of St. John Passion, where this pulsing continuo and those swirling figures in the strings are a prelude to the story that's following. Can you hear the pulsing underneath? And then the repeated, agitated figures in the strings. All there to create a mood that fits the message that's going to follow. Well, we have a similar kind of tremolo happens in the beginning of our cantata, and it's very powerful. Now, many of you remember back in 2017, several years of Bach Tage were devoted the next couple of years to the cantatas for the season of Easter of 1724, which was the season of Easter that followed the St. John Passion. We saw in those how the St. John Passion was extended into the text and the music of those cantatas that were scheduled for that period. Well, Cantata 105 suggests that the Passion also cast a shadow months previous to its debut. that maybe this music was already deep in Bach's mind. Possibly he was already working on the St. John Passion, because beside the tremolos there are other similarities, not the least of which is that they're in the same key, G minor. But also these very stress-filled suspensions that happen in the upper instruments. In St. John Passion, the tension builds during the orchestral introduction. And then eventually just erupts in choral shouts of "Here, here!" And you know, we have the same sort of thing in our cantata, don't we? Where the first word that we utter is "here." The poet chooses a psalm for the text of the opening statement in both cantatas, and ours is Psalm 143, verse 2. Our chorus is, as we know, unfolds in two sections, what Halbardier calls a prelude and a fugue, because the first part definitely sets the stage for the fugue that follows, which is the main event. In the prelude, we sing these ascending sequential patterns that you're familiar with if you've been rehearsing, perhaps to suggest the sinner's pleading for mercy to God. They go like this. Step higher, step higher, then it resolves. Oh. Let's sing along a little bit. Get a second try. That's a good thing. All right, that's one more slide.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You sounded lovely.
Getting closer. Getting closer. Yeah, him. One more time. end of the vocal parts, the instrument continues softly over this pedal point. Organists know what a pedal point is. And that's just kind of like a moment of reflection before we go on with the fugue. Now, the fugue is a kind of fugue that we know from previous Bach Tages, a permutation fugue. Now, before charging ahead, I'm going to ask, how many of you can explain what makes a fugue a permutation fugue? All Westermeyer, be quiet. Well, a couple of you can kind of go like this, yeah. Well, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going to make you endure my explanation if you already knew, but since it looks like we need to learn, I remember you're going through this only because you're making me do it. Okay? A permutation fugue is developed out of 4 short phrases, which in my case I'm going to label A, B, C, and D. A is the subject of the fugue, and B, C, and D are counter subjects, which are lines that will work polyphonically with the main subject. They always appear, or not always, but mostly appear in the same order, A, B, C, and D. So look at the tenor part in your score at measure 37, because the tenor goes through the series first, and you may want to mark them so that you can keep them for later reference. So here is A. That's it. And then B picks right up with the next note. And then C is right after it. And then D. It makes a very nice melody all by itself in these 4 segments. Sounds like it would be very simple, except it's got to be terribly hard to write initially. Now, Bach treats letter D, the last segment, as kind of a wild card, because sometimes it's left out, sometimes it's duplicated and repeated. Sometimes it's extended a bit in order to be able to accomplish his goal with the music. So the tenor begins by singing A, B, C, D. Now, just as he gets good and started, the bass chimes in with A, B, etc., you know? So they're singing in counterpoint. And then the soprano joins at measure 57. A, B, C, D, okay? And then finally the alto at measure 60. Now, so far it sort of looks like a canon, doesn't it? It does, essentially a canon at the 5th. So, but now, surprise, the tenor and the sopranos are going to repeat music D, the theme D, before they start over again. But the alto and bass don't complete the series. They skip right back to A and leave out D. Now, as a fugue keeps developing, Bach will keep doing this, repeating D, altering and lengthening its elements, all the time tightening the tension in the music to drive home the sense of angst in this sinner who realized that no one living is righteous before God. But notice that if you look at it vertically, there is no time when any voice is singing the same segment. But it gets a very rich texture because of the thing of the melody floating from bottom to top in the texture contrapuntally. So that's a permutation fugue. So, want to hear it? Let's try it. Now, this may be a little fast for us, so just sing along quietly. basses? No, I sang sopranos. No, it is basses. Now it's sopranos. And then alto. They've been doing this for a lot of performances before they record it. Suzuki usually takes things out on tour before he records them, and that means the chorus will have performed it at least 20 times by this time before they ever put it on a recording. So they got it pretty well nailed. So next comes this very expressive, even though simple, recitative. It's only accompanied by the continuo. This kind of spare texture suggests the isolation that a sinner feels in their angst, knowing their sin, knowing the judgment he or she faces. Even the simplest movement of the cantata, Bach's attention to detail, is remarkable. The text, it conveys the anxiety of the sinner very powerfully. Each phrase is given a special shape and nuance in sympathy with the sinner's emotions over sin. I've highlighted two phrases that really stand out to me. One is in measures 2 and 3, where Bach sends the alto all the way down to a low B natural for the words of, "I bow down before you in humility." But then he immediately gives her in our case, her, an upward swirl of notes that suggest this anxious sinner looking up at the countenance of God. And another one that really stands out to me is at measure 11, this diminished chord in the continuo for the text of the weakness of my soul. I guess is the best way to say it. The weakness of my soul that I cannot deny or cover up. So, listen to it. It's a wonderful piece. Now the aria that follows it is a reminder that not all sinners are remorseful. Some will blame and accuse others or excuse themselves. or lie and deceive to cover up the wrong that they've done. We have the tremolo that makes a reappearance in this aria. The tremolo that he had in the first chorus. The viola has it in eighth notes, but the violin's tremolo that goes on above it is more intense, as you can see. It's in 16th notes. The two are combined there to suggest what the text says is the zittern und wanken, the wavering and the trembling of the sinner looking this way or that for a way out. And this whole thing feels kind of unstable without the familiar grounding of the continuo. The viola carries the lowest notes of the texture because the sinner is alone on uncertain ground, and that's what he tries to capture. The oboe also suggests this unsettled conscience going back and forth, looking this way and that. And when the soprano comes in, she takes up this oboe theme, if you will, the zittern und wanken. And they go into this kind of canonic push-pull for most of the aria, is what is contained there. They just keep exchanging their accusations and excuses until we get all the way back to measure 78, where there's a change, kind of like a B section before the completion of the aria, where the words, "The frightened conscience is tortured and torn on a rack it has created for itself." He's writing for you. It's an amazing piece. It's literally one of a kind of Bach. I'll listen to it a little bit because it is so special. Look another way. That's when it starts getting kind of athletic. It's an amazing piece. Just kind of one of a kind. It sounds very much like one of the arias from the St. Matthew Passion, but it's very much in keeping with the whole mood of what we've gone to so far. But as we know, the next thing that happens is a total contrast with everything that's gone before, but especially with the other recitative. In number 2, the sinner was filled with guilt and remorse. But here you got the very first word is full, which means secure, satisfied, whatever like that. And looking up, the sinner sees that the writing on his death sentence is now obliterated. It can't be read anymore because it's all covered with Jesus' blood. Jesus has personally nailed this page to the cross. this is an accompanied as opposed to the very simple recitative number 2. The bass is pizzicato, very gentle, suggesting now a quieted heartbeat as opposed to the more stressed one from before. The figures in the upper strings suggest kind of a slow swaying dance, or maybe even a peaceful nature scene of grass growing. I also thought perhaps of the St. Olaf Choir in performance. So we have the text which echoes John chapter 14, of course, that at our death Christ will return, taking us body and soul to the Father. Listen to a little bit of it. Clearly, Bach is moving us to a different mood with this piece, too. First saying of the words "die ewig pare." I can't read the screen. What does it say on it? Anyway, about the house of God that we are being carried to. It gives this very florid melisma just to get a sense of the awe of what the presence of God must look like. It's also interesting the way he cuts it. The vocal line off on the third as opposed to completing it. Leaves it kind of incomplete. Don't know quite how to end that experience of seeing God's face for the first time. So, anyway, with number 5, we get a whole new sound in this cantata. Joy. At last, because as St. Paul says, we forgiven sinners should walk in newness of life, and here we have a nice dance to dance to. The violin gives this incredible swirl of rapid playing around the melody. And we get a brand new voice in the orchestra, the corno da Tararsi. Don't feel any embarrassment if you've never seen a corno da Tararsi before, or even heard of one before, because there aren't any surviving instruments from the Baroque era. Never was. In fact, there were no known makers of the corno da Tararsi in the Baroque era. Very little to prove the darn thing even existed, except that one composer wrote music for it, and that, of course, is Bach, who wrote a part for the corno da Tararsi in 3 cantatas from 1723. They're listed here. Yeah, there they are. All right. And so, but additionally, Bach wrote 27 more cantatas where he marked the part only corno. But it's pretty clear from the music that it's the corno da trarsi, because it would have been impossible to play on a natural horn. Because historians believe that the corno da trarsi had a sliding mechanism like a trombone, perhaps even a double slide, in order to be able to get some of the notes that would not be available otherwise. Because he frequently writes in flat keys, and then he throws in a bunch of accidentals as well. This is not natural music for a natural instrument. Bach had never written for the corno da trarsi before he came to Leipzig. But in Leipzig, he had this wonderful brass player, Gottfried Reiche, who must have owned and played the corno da trarsi. The instrument he holds in his portraiture may even be his corno da trarsi. Interestingly, Reiche's death was the end of Bach's use of the instrument, and possibly the end of the corno da trarsi. At Reiche's death, there was none listed in the inventory of his estate. It's possible, according to Chris Wapas, who has played the corno da trarsi for us in this performance, the instrument is truly a beast to play. So it's possible Reiche threw his on a scrap metal heap somewhere through frustration. Anyway, after he died, whenever Bach would repeat one of these cantatas, he had to rewrite the parts, because either Reiche's successors weren't up to playing it or they didn't have an instrument to play it on. Now, corno da trarsi literally means pull horn. Not bullhorn, pull horn. And because of the sliding mechanism that is affixed to it to be able to get the accidentals that's needed. Of all the pieces that Bach wrote for the corno, it's the number one chorus is probably the hardest. And it's rarely heard in live performances. The corno is rarely heard there because of the fact that it's so easy to get out of tune notes that you can't repair in recording sessions like you can with a recording. So many times it's just done with the oboes, and that's why we're going to do it. But it's also interesting to know that the few modern players who have instruments like this have had them built to a certain design. Some of them are elongated, straight instruments, others are coiled up. The one that Chris has is a straight instrument with the slide, as you'll be able to see when we're rehearsing it. So at any rate, this is a paper by Olivier Picon, no slouch of a trumpet player, a brass player himself, and it tells you everything that you would ever possibly want to know about the corno da trarsi, but it's very wonderful reading, and there's a website address here that I can give you. It's free, and it's well worth the read just because it's a fascinating study. So, at any rate, that's the corno da trarsi, and here's the way it sounds in the piece. You can't be happy and tapping your foot with this one, you're just not. You haven't got it. Yeah. And then finally we conclude with the chorale, number 6. And this is the final third appearance of the tremolo. But here it gets used for a much different purpose. Because unlike in 1 and 3, when it was trying to express the angst and distress of the sinner, here Bach uses the tremolo very creatively to portray the stilling of the anxious spirit of a sinner in the peace of Christ. because the tremolo starts out with 4 repeated notes under a single bow, as you can see. And then when we come down to phrase number 3, it reduces to 3 notes under the bow. And then the next pair of phrases, it goes down to 2 notes under the bow. 2 notes per beat, I should say, 2 notes per beat. And then finally, at the very end, goes into kind of 2 notes with a kind of a gentle rocking motion. And then finally, at the very end, just a single quarter note for each beat. Let's sing it together. Okay. You're going to follow it up here so you can see the scores. Now, I have no idea what Bach is doing with this passus duriusculus at the end, that half-step descent, which is typically associated with sorrow and suffering. It's effective, but I have no idea what he's doing. Is it because he's trying to say the death of anxiety, or is he trying to remind us that it was the death of Christ that brought this peace about? One of those things to put on your list for the possible dinner table conversation. When you get the chance, you know. So, any rate, what we have in summary then is the first 3 movements of the cantata just plumb the angst of a sinner facing the wages of sin, which the scripture says is death. But of course, beginning with Adam and Eve, leaving sinners to earn their way home forgiveness is not in God's way. God simply loves us too much. And that's the good news that fills the final 3 movements. Robert Marshall was the editor of Cantata 105 for the Neue Bauhausgabe, and he actually has written his analysis of Cantata 105 in his book on the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. He says that remarkably, the piece was composed straight through, directly, in one straight flow of composition, which is really unusual. That, you know, and it looks like he just wrote it all out once and then made a few corrections in it before it went to the copyist. Very unusual. And he probably did it over a very short span during the week of its prelude or its premiere to get it prepared for the performance. So he says, you know, there's no way to get beyond it. It's a masterpiece. And I agree. Now, very, very briefly, a few words about the French Baroque composer Charpentier. His creative life coincided with the reign of Louis XIV, who is also known as the Sun King. And, you know, the court of Louis XIV was probably one of the most lavish displays of royal wealth and pomp and power and political backstabbing in the history of the French rule. Here's Louis in an ad for his new line of 18th century businessmen's caddies. He's known sometimes as Louis the Great. No doubt a nickname. He thought very fitting for himself. How many of you have heard this piece before? Yeah. His march from his Te Deum. It's still used as a fanfare during television broadcasts of the Eurovision network. At age 20, Charpentier went to Italy, where he studied with the great composer and teacher Carissimi. He came back to France, though, in the mid-1720s, I'm way off in my years, 1620s. And he basically dominated the Baroque musical scene of the 17th century because of the quality and how prolific he was in his composing. His talent as a composer was acknowledged by all of his contemporaries. Well, maybe that should be tempered with almost all his contemporaries, but unfortunately not two who really counted, which was Louis XIV and his favorite court musician, Jean-Baptiste Lully. To the point that even though Charpentier dominated the musical scene in almost every category, it was not in opera, because the opera was out of bounds by royal decree. The only one who could compose opera for the Paris Opera was Lully. At his death, Charpentier left a legacy of more than 800 pieces and at least 10 settings of the Magnificat. In 1670, he became master of music in the service of the Duchess of Guise, or as she preferred to be called, Mademoiselle Guise. He, for the next 17 years, composed a lot of vocal works for her, most of it religious music, probably including our Magnificat. But in 1687, Mademoiselle de Guise was dying. And around that time, Charpentier entered the employees of the Jesuits of Paris. And so from 1687 to 98, he served as master of music to the Jesuits, first at their college in the Latin Quarter of Paris, and then at the Jesuits' Church of Saint-Louis, on the Rue Saint-Antoine on the other side of the Seine. In 1690, he finally received royal permission to produce an opera in Paris. No coincidence that Lully had died 2 years before. No Lully, no more opera monopoly. Unfortunately, Charpentier's opera wasn't a big success. They closed after a short run. And from that time on, Charpentier returned to composing mostly religious music. After his decade with the Jesuits at Saint-Louis, he was appointed master of music for the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which is near Notre Dame, the home of these wonderful, wonderful display of stained glass windows. He died in 1704 and was buried in a little cemetery just behind the choir of Sainte-Chapelle. He wrote 10 settings of the Magnificat, and each one of them is different, has different scoring, structure, just an indication of how creative a fellow he was. Ours, most people think, stands out for the variety that includes of vocal and instrumental writing. And I mentioned before the generosity of our friends at Canberra Baroque, who made it possible for us to use their edition. So there we have it, what we're going to be doing at Vespers tomorrow at 4 p.m. Invite your friends, and we're going to have a wonderful weekend of learning together and singing. Any questions or comments or thoughts? Come on, Paul, you always have. Yeah, Don.
A great presentation.
Thank you. That's kind.
It's really good. One little thing that I did, and maybe you covered this, I missed your beginning.
Oh, you missed the best part.
Right. But I was curious what else was going on in 1723. And the most interesting thing I thought was Ben Franklin arrives in Philadelphia at age 17. So it's a kind of a moment in intellectual history where, you know, so you get.
Ben Franklin ended up being at the court of Louis XVI.
Is that right?
That's when he went to, yeah. So it's right in that era. Ben was just a teenager at that point, yeah. But the things that were going on in terms of the beginning of a more legalistic theology in the Lutheran Church that was starting to take root in the Leipzig clergy already at that point, and which, you know, if you really want to know about that, this is really the book to look at, is Eric Chafee. It's just a deep, deep plow into that whole situation and the amazing hot water that Bach got himself into over the St. John Passion. But it's also covered very well in John Gardner's book. And I know that Paul, no, it wasn't you that was reading it. Somebody else was reading it here recently. Yeah, you reading it? Yeah. And he covers that same topic very well and a little bit more readably than Chafee. This is like reading an encyclopedia. Good stuff. Any other questions or if you have questions or thoughts during the week, please, or the weekend, please bring them up. Be sure to take a copy of Royce's obituary so that you have that. Maybe you can spend a few minutes with it during the weekend. It's a wonderful, wonderful tribute to him and has some wonderful quotes from our friend Kathy and her daughter, Anna. Thank you.